welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea that I have for you guys comes from way earlier in history than we usually cover. Despite the fact that we normally say from all throughout history in the intro, we often focus on the 20th and the 19th centuries and even more recent like technology stuff because that's stuff that we have a lot of documentation on. But today we're going to be talking about the first mooning recorded in history.
How far back are we going for this?
This happens in the 1st century. All right, somewhere around 50 AD. I was not able to be more exact than that, but it happens in the reign of this guy, Ventidius Cumanus, and he reigns for only 4 years, from 48 AD to 52 AD, so it's got to be somewhere in there. And it happens in Jerusalem. And at this point in history, Jerusalem has been essentially the vassal of another country for like 600 years. It hasn't been the same country. You start off with Babylon coming in and taking over them, and then they pass on to the Persians, and the Persians pass on to the Greeks, and at this point in history, the Greeks have passed Jerusalem on to the Romans. But the Jews and the Romans, in particular, really don't get along. And the reason they don't get along is because of religion. All right, they don't talk religion and politics, right? And the Jews and the Romans are definitely butting up against each other over religion and politics because the Jews say there's only one God. And the Romans say, actually, there's a lot. And
we got a whole pantheon.
And in particular, we're saying that Caesar is a god. Now, Julius Caesar had set this up around 50 BC, where he decides that because of his lineage, which historically was supposed to come from some of the gods, and because of his status, that he was actually and literally allowed to be enshrined as one of the pantheon of gods that had to be worshipped like a god, and he would have statues and they would make sacrifices to him, including not just the Roman temples, but the temple in Jerusalem, where that temple wasn't for like just any gods. In the Jews' minds, that's not okay for you to put your statue up. And they did work it out. They managed to talk it out with the guy who was sent to go ahead and put this statue up and say, like, we're not having this. And he's like, please, guys. Like,
it's my head. Like,
it's my head. And they're like, we will lay down and die. Like, they literally, they essentially go on strike several times in the histories that I was looking up for this story. The Jews go on strike, not tilling the fields. There's also times where in the course of this whole thing that's going to play out, they'll go to the people in charge and say, we're not okay with this. And they're like, well, we'll kill you. And the Jews will just be like, here's my neck. Go. And like call their bluff, like just like expose their neck, and the guy's like, I don't like want to kill you. I'd really prefer to just have some peace here. But there is this huge amount of unrest where they don't like being under the foot of the Roman Empire. They don't appreciate the laws that they're asked to follow. There's a lot of friction based on all this religion stuff. So there is a certain amount of, okay, we're not killing each other right now. You'll sort of let us do our thing and we'll sort of not be in open rebellion. And around this time, Passover happens. And at the time of Passover, there are a lot of people who come to Jerusalem who aren't normally there. All right, it's already a relatively populous city, but if you are a Jew at this time, you want to go to the temple, you want to be part of the sacrifice, and so wherever you are at in the world, you try to make this pilgrimage to Jerusalem to be there for the Passover. So the population of the city swells dramatically, and as you can imagine, the people who are in charge here, the Romans, the government, sees this Even if there wasn't any conflict at all, you would still be worried about, just a bunch more people coming in the city. You're going to beef up security and make sure that there's, people sort of watching the streets. But with the kind of strife that has been happening between the Jews and the Romans, they are on high alert.
Yeah, it's not just a normal Passover where you'd want to do that because anytime you've got that many more people around, it's going to cause some issues. It's full on, they're near the edge of a rebellion.
Yes. And so you have on these rooftops overlooking the entrance to the temple, you have these Roman guards set up who are there to keep the peace. Except one of these guys, these Roman soldiers, for whatever reason, and we don't know, his name is not recorded by history, his motives are not recorded by history. All we know is what Josephus, the Jewish historian, recorded. And he said that this guard who's standing there overlooking throngs of thousands of people who have come to worship their God at this temple, I'm quoting now, quote, "One of the soldiers pulled back his garment and cowering down after an indecent manner, turned his breech to the Jews and spake such words as you might expect upon such a posture."
I really want to know what words you can expect upon such a posture.
Well, so in my mind, there's a couple of ways you could interpret that. He's being relatively tame with how he's describing this act of mooning. This guy's pulled up his robe and showed his butt to these guys. And the one obvious interpretation is that he just lets loose a string of insults. There's also the possibility that words aren't literally words and that he's farting in their general direction.
We all know that that's a great instigator.
Or that he's blowing a raspberry at them. But regardless of exactly what these words would have meant or said, the Jews are not happy. They have endured a lot of indignities in sort of the pursuit of their religion and the purity of how they're going to worship their God. And they have just been massively insulted by the symbol of the people who are trying to take that away from them. And a riot breaks out. Now, it's not a full-blown riot immediately. There are some people who are level-headed and they're very offended by this, but they go to Cumanus, the governor, if you'll recall from the beginning, and they are petitioning him my dude, this is not okay. You're in charge here. This really offensive thing has happened. You gotta call this guy on the carpet. He needs to be punished. The problem is, as they're having this grown-up response conversation where they're trying to smooth it all over and do the thing where they've talked it out in the past, it's for varying levels of success. All right, this is from the second book of the Wars of the Jews that Josephus wrote, so there's a lot of conflict in their past. While they're trying to smooth this over, some of the people in the crowd have not been so level-headed, and they've picked up stones and started throwing them at the soldiers. And Cumanus decides, we can't have this. And he calls in the reserves, all right? He has these guys posted as the peacekeepers, but they're not really an army there. There might be a few hundred. I wasn't able to get exact numbers from the original accounts, but we're not talking about a force of men. But now Cumanus decides, okay, enough is enough. People are throwing stones at my guys. I'm here to keep the peace. I am calling in the backup. And he calls in many more soldiers into the temple and starts driving people out. And the result here is a panic. Because now the people, and you got to remember, again, it's not just people from Jerusalem, it's people from outlying areas, it's people from even potentially other countries who have come to this place, and maybe they don't even necessarily have a dog in this fight, some of them, other than just let us worship our God and be cool guys. Now these, huge amounts of what we would essentially call riot police have shown up, but what really causes the disaster here is the stampede, Because when these soldiers come in, everybody who is in this very small area decides they don't want to be there anymore. And they start to run. And the numbers of dead that are recorded by history range from the low end at 10,000 to the high end at around 30,000 who are killed just in the stampede.
That's insane. I can't even imagine seeing that at all. Like, 10,000 people is an insane number, and to die in a stampede and the violence therein? Holy crap.
It's unsettling. I've seen sort of modern equivalents, not personally, but I've like read about mob mentalities and what can happen, and just the act of like everybody pushing to get in a place. You might not even fall down, but you can be so compressed by the crowd that you're not able to breathe. Or if you fall down in that crowd, you're definitely like not getting back up because the guy who's stepping on top of you has somebody pushing into the back of him, and he's pushing into the back of somebody else. And those guys, like, there's not room for them to move to let you up. So you got people trampled, you have people being crushed to death. And potentially you also have people just being killed by the Romans. Although that wasn't the recorded history by the guy who would have been sympathetic to saying the Romans did it, mostly blames it on just the crush of people trying to get away. And it becomes this massive mourning moment for the Jews at this time. And I don't want to slip into hyperbole here, or rather I do want to, but I want to temper this by saying there's a lot of things that lead up to this and come after this. But it's worth noting that around 10 years, 15 years after this conflict is really going to kick into gear. At AD 66, the Jews finally decide that they have had enough, and they try to rise up against their Roman counterparts. And the Romans finally decide they've had enough, and they come in with their full force and just level the city and wipe out like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in their just, we've had it. You guys have been a thorn in our side for like hundreds of years now. Now you're like trying to rise up and throw off your government. No. And this is definitely a domino in that chain. This contributes to that ultimate destruction where these guys could not find a way to get along. They could not figure out how to peaceably live alongside of each other. And it ultimately cost them. It cost everybody, really. I mean, Cumanus loses his seat over this. Maybe not over this exact thing, but just over the fact that...
Oh, for not maintaining the peace.
Yes. Him and some of his other guys, with this and along with another situation where he doesn't immediately dispense justice over a guy who's killed by the neighboring area called the Samaritans, Julius Caesar essentially like has him called on the carpet and other people pulled in, but it doesn't help the situation. Like I say Julius Caesar, this is a new Caesar from before, not the original Julius Caesar. He might not even be called Julius, but there's a lot of people who were named the same at this time. It was even tricky doing the research for the timeline because of trying to figure out like when in time things happened, and the Wikipedia page was actually wrong about when this incident happens, Tony. I was so excited this was going to be in AD 66, and it like literally kicks off the Jewish rebellion and the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem, but I dug into it and the facts did not support that. I wanted that to be the story so bad.
That this was the full thing, not the precursor like 10 years prior.
Yes. But, you know, sometimes history doesn't stand up to your cool story.
Yeah. That would be
stupid truth.
Yeah, especially whenever you want to say Jerusalem was destroyed because of a mooning. It was a Roman soldier. I don't know like which side I expected to moon, but I think it's weirder that it's like the Roman soldier.
It's such an odd thing. I don't know what exactly the dynamic is like back there. There has to be some animus, right? Just in general, knowing how people are today and are supposedly, you know, attempting to be enlightened era, you know, where we still have kind of tribalism, and, you know, you look sideways at the guy who doesn't look like you, maybe you don't, all right? But there's
I have a problem with like people who like other football teams. Like there's still a lot of tribalism that happens.
Yes, and so you can see where this guy's like, these idiots. Maybe he's bored. Maybe it's like close to the end of his shift. He doesn't. Maybe somebody dares him to do it. Yeah. Possibly.
He's just got a satchel full of wine or a sleeve or whatever it is, like the skins. That's it.
I can't imagine this guy anticipated the level of response and just carnage that would have happened because of his idiotic actions, but we'll never know. So
it's lost to history.
The bad idea today is mooning. Don't do it. You could kill upwards of 30,000 people.
Ugh. Mooning leading to squishing. It's just so visceral. It's so messed up.
It's one of those great stories where you're like, this is hilarious and equally horrifying. Like, your brain wants to laugh about like he showed him his butt, and then you're like, oh, there's so many people died.
Yeah, it reminds me of the scene in Braveheart where like the entire Scots people are just like brandishing, like just mooning the entire army across the way. But that's a whole army doing it before a fight. This is a little bit different, and also not historically accurate for that movie. So
we're not talking about Braveheart. But yes, the lens of history and the length of time it was ago, I think, lets us view it a little bit more humorously. But definitely at the time, we're talking about like something that the country would mourn, for years and years to come. Just like, can you imagine 30,000 Americans dying at a single time over anything? Even 10,000, right? We talked about the I thought about the Las Vegas shooter, where 50 people died in a single event and several hundred more were wounded, and we look at that as being some kind of carnage. For the fact that you would have more than 1,000 die. I mean, this is more people than died in 9/11 by a lot.
Yeah, like 3 times more at the low end. It could
in
be
a
10
smaller city. I mean, we're talking about a much earlier time when there was this much smaller population. So the dent that this makes in the population of the entire city, it's just the magnitude of it, I think, is difficult to imagine in the modern day. And the historians of the time, I think, record it relatively dispassionately, but it must have been so just like devastating to have this happen.
Yeah, it's like everybody in Jerusalem had to have known people that died in that event.
For sure.
Every single person had to have known somebody.
And it probably affects your workforce, right? Like, how many people are there to do the work? Like, the economy's impacted.
It probably affected the future rebellion, too, because if you're going up against the Roman legionnaires, you need everybody.
This is all just sort of speculation and trying to fill in the gaps on my part, obviously, but it's a fascinating story. I wish we had more info on it, but I pulled up as many sort of original sources as I could, and it's just a kind of a footnote in the many, many trials and tribulations that the Hebrew people have been through in their long existence, and somehow they managed to hang on, Tony.
Yep.
Anyway, that is all I have for this story of the first mooning, Tony. I appreciate everybody listening. If you like this, don't forget to subscribe on whatever podcast app that you happen to favor. Don't forget, if you have bad ideas, you can send them to @HumanEchoes on Twitter or badideashow@gmail.com. That's our email address. And just let us know what you would like to hear us cover. And we'll see you guys next week with something else.
Yep. Also, check out our YouTube, youtube.com/HumanEchoes. We do a lot of cool gaming content and all sorts of other stuff. We will talk to you guys very soon. Have a good day.
Bye.